Great, thank you very much, Michelle. So good evening and welcome to the fourth presentation of a five-part webinar series. My name is Richard Witham and I'm the chair of the Greater Sudbury Watershed Alliance. Joining me on screen is Terry Rees, Executive Director of the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Associations, Dr. John Gunn, Founding Director of the Ballet Living with Lakes Centre, Bree Edwards from the Ballet Living with Lakes Centre, and Dr. Andrea Kirkwood, our speaker for this evening. I just wanted to assure people that we have been reading your survey information and input that you've put in. And I realize that for some of you who watch every session, the intro pieces at the beginning may appear a bit redundant, but we do have new people who are coming in. And so we need to go through that orientation at the beginning. So I just ask for your patience. The Greater Sudbury Watershed Alliance recognizes the ancestral land on which we live and work as the traditional territory of the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Algonquin, and Métis peoples. This territory is covered by the treaties of Robinson-Huron, Manitoulin Island, and Treaty 9, with Wakwemekong remaining unceded. We offer our gratitude to the First Nations for their protection of and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. We are recording all of the webinars, and links to the recordings will be posted on our respective websites so that those who are unable to join us this evening will still be able to view the presentations. The Greater Sudbury Watershed Alliance acts to promote, protect, and advocate for improvements in water quality and healthy watersheds. We have representation from 23 lake and creek stewardships and 2 First Nations. Although much of our focus is on the protection of the local watersheds, we also respond to municipal and provincial government activities that reduce environmental protection and increase risk to aquatic environments. We are grateful to have partnered with the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Associations and with Ballet Living with Lakes Centre in the presentation of the Troubled Water series. We are interested in learning where the attendees for this evening's presentation are from. So Michelle, can you bring up the poll? And I would ask individuals to please indicate where they're from. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the individual or individuals from Srinagar, India, who joined last week at 5:30 a.m. Sunday morning, or Friday morning, sorry, not Sunday morning, but Friday morning. So that's pretty early. And I want to admit that's great dedication. And how many do we have in the poll at the moment? Okay, so unfortunately we're missing that. Looks like we're missing the individual from India, but we do have 3 people from the US and 6 from outside of Ontario. But again, as we have been in the past, it looks like about a 50-50 split with the Greater Sudbury area and the remaining roughly 50% coming from outside of Greater Sudbury, but within the province of Ontario. All right, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. John Gunn.
Thank you very much. And thank you for allowing me to squeeze into the opening event tonight, especially because it's about community science and citizen science. And I just needed a chance to respond to all the emails and letters about the fate of the Living with Lakes Centre amidst the financial crisis at Laurentian. And I wanted to give you some information about that. But before I do that, I have to apologize myself. I made my own mistake about situations that people are going through at this time, and I didn't intend to do it, but it is the reality of the pandemic, is when I was trying to talk about inequity in the climate issue, I made the comment that, you know, landowners around lakes and cottage owners are rich compared to the low rental housing kids that I was talking about. That's not the case for a lot of people right now in the middle of this crisis, that people are clearly living on limited incomes and buried in taxes. And I'm sure there's some failed businesses out there. So sorry to be flippant about that, but I wanted to make the point that when we think about protecting lakes, we have to consider the public access issue. Is we can't leave kids stuck in stifled apartments and not have access to clean beaches. And private property issues are always an issue, but we have to advocate for access to healthy beaches and access to lakes during this period ahead of us in a warming climate. The Lake Center is a world-class research center, and Bree Edwards is standing here to demonstrate that tonight. We have super young star researchers here. We've produced 80 masters and PhDs that are spread all over the world doing great work. We've had 600 students going through the place. But carrying the name Living with Lake Center, that's not the name of one would typically get for a high-end research institute, because it is a community center at the same time. It was a community effort to build the Lake Center. People did bake sales and adopted lakes, and the Lake Center, we had to set parts of the property aside so they could still come and go fishing, and there's a disabled access to the dock. We have lunch with the lake music every month. We have art shows, the naturalist clubs meet there. Margaret Atwood held her birthday party there 10 years in a row, and she hosted the water poetry contest that led to the first poet laureate in Sudbury. Alex Trebek hosted the Amazing Race Canada, and a young Trudeau was there to announce his campaign and his science policy. And most important, my daughter had her wedding reception at the Lake Center. So that's the kind of place it is. And the community funded fundraising campaign was a slug, because we had to meet the requirement of being mortgage free the day we opened. 6 years, $22 million later, we built and opened a glorious center that's won prizes over the world for green design. We won the 3rd place in North America for green design. We won the Lieutenant Governor's Sustainability Prize. We won the Design with Wood Prize. But we also have inspired a lot of young people in this regard. But a week before the series started, we were looking darn good. We had a very large bank account. We had a large research grant in place. We didn't have a mortgage. We even had some of the capital campaign left over. All of that is uncertain right now. I don't intend to lose this battle, but we're in an extreme insolvency issue. And I'll need everybody online tonight to support going forward. But I don't want to focus on buildings and mortar. What I realized through this period of collapse these last few weeks was how vulnerable students are. If they don't have support in the summertime, when they're not able to work at restaurant jobs, they have to be fully funded to do science in the summer. And we don't have enough resources to keep students employed or supported. So I've been inspired by this Troubled Water Symposium, and I think once the lawyers have had their fun with us, and we know what the situation is in May or August, you're gonna hear again from us that we'll need to start a fundraising campaign for students, not just domestic students. We're not just looking after our own. There's international students that need the resources as much as we do. So please help out again. You were great to help out to build the building, but we'd like to establish a Living with Lakes Center, a Living with Lakes summer research bursary program for needy graduate students. A lot of them have kids and families, so I think it'll be an easy sell. So thank you very much for that tonight.
Well, thanks, John. I guess that's to me. Certainly, we all have a interest in having science that's well funded and supported for all of our interests across Ontario. I work with the Federation of Ontario Cottagers. My name is Terry Reese, and we represent the interests of cottagers across the province, 500 groups, 250,000 people who own property, and all of us rely on informed decisions, and much of that based on good science, so the kind of science that happens at Laurentian. Folk is a longstanding supporter of citizen science, and as such, we're extremely excited to have Dr. Andrea Kirkwood with us tonight to talk about the productive marriage of community priorities, scientific inquiry, and resource management. Our main interest in this area has been around the Lake Partner Program. That's a long-term water quality monitoring program, 600 sites, several decades of data that informs a lot of our decisions and a lot of research that goes on. So Andrea will talk a lot more about that and much more tonight. We're blessed with an abundance of fresh water in Ontario, and with the commitment of all of us, with the knowledge and expertise available through partners like Dr. Kirkwood and her colleagues, we'll be better able to address the important issues that face us in the years ahead. As Michelle mentioned, tonight's Zoom feature will include everyone on mute, just so it's quiet. If you are having any technical difficulties, we might suggest that you just log off and log back on. If you're not able to get back on, there is a synchronous event happening on YouTube. And if you need to pose questions or if something comes up, just mouse over the Q&A button and enter those at any time at the end of the session. We'll get to as many as we can. So thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to a great session tonight. So over to Bree.
Thanks so much, Terry. Our speaker this week is Dr. Andrea Kirkwood, as Terry mentioned. Andrea is an associate professor and a program director for undergraduate biology at Ontario Tech University. Andrea has a broad array of expertise in environmental science, aquatic ecology, microbiology, and much more. And she's a driving force for progress on freshwater issues in Canada through multiple avenues. Some examples: she serves on the executive committee of our Society for Canadian Limnologists, and has recently finished a federal appointment with the International Joint Commission on Great Lakes Science Advisory. Andrea leads a diverse graduate student group with a focus on applied issues and active engagement of communities and stakeholders in knowledge co-production. So tonight, Andrea is going to be giving us a behind-the-scenes look at how community science co-production can be used to generate critical knowledge around emerging issues in freshwater science, and how it can be used to mobilize support for lake management. Over to you, Andrea.
Great, thank you so much. What a nice introduction, Bree. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Make sure I'm doing it right. Okay, so hopefully you all see my screen in presentation mode. So welcome. As Bree had mentioned, my talk tonight is using the community science co-production model to inform lake management, but really it takes a village to manage and protect lake health. And so I really just want to start with a land acknowledgement for where I'm situated right now, which is on the lands of the people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. And I'm thankful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. The lands I am situated on are covered under the Williams Treaties and are the traditional territory of the Mississauga, a branch of the Great Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. These lands remain home to a number of Indigenous nations and people who have cared for Turtle Island, also known as North America, from before the arrival of settler peoples. Most importantly, I remember the history of poor treatment and the lack of friendship with the First Nations who call these lands home. This history is something we all are affected by as treaty people in Canada. Our past defines our present, but if we move forward as friends and allies, then it does not have to define our future. So as Bree alluded to, we do a wide array of research related to freshwater science in my lab. And I thought I would just give a brief overview of the scales of research, because we study everything from organisms that live in freshwater ecosystems to communities. So these are assemblages of species, to ecosystems, from stormwater ponds to lakes and wetlands, and then finally landscapes. And so actually a lot of focus right now in our lab is to look at the effect of land use and environmental gradients on structuring water quality as well as aquatic communities. And so tonight I'm going to focus on the research we do related to community science. And so primarily this is research that's being conducted by Erin Smith, who is a doctoral candidate in my lab. So before I get into talking about community science and co-production, I thought it would be important to just talk about water quality. It's probably a term that you've heard of quite often, especially if you're actively involved in a lake association or in paying attention to the water quality of your local water bodies. And so I would just say, simply put, water quality is an umbrella term for lake condition. So the condition of the water that's in your lake. And so condition can be based on a number of different parameters or, chemicals or even organisms like algae, chlorophyll A, can be part of water quality. So there isn't a specific definition, but really water quality can be measured by one parameter, say phosphorus, or a whole suite of parameters. And so before I get into talking about what information we can get from measuring water quality, I think I'd like to run the first poll, if that's possible.
So the question before you is, a lake with high nutrient concentrations is unhealthy. True or false? We have a bright audience with us this evening. They're not going to be fooled.
That's wonderful. Yes, the majority of you got that correct. It is false. And admittedly, that's a question I would field my students as well, because I think there's this perception that, low nutrients, those are those oligotrophic lakes in, cottage country that are clear water, whereas, high nutrients, too much phosphorus and nitrogen, they're weedy lakes and too much algae. And in fact, it really it has to be context specific. For sure, if you start having really high amounts of phosphorus entering a lake on the Canadian Shield, then for sure that would be an indication that's an impacted lake. But there's lots of lakes that we would refer to as productive lakes that, yeah, they have high phosphorus. They may not be ideal for swimming in, but boy, do they support productive fish communities. Lakes out in Alberta, for example, are naturally high in phosphorus. So it's just getting you to think about, when we talk about nutrients, that it's not always, good or bad or high or low, that there's always, what we call these gradients, the gray area in between. And it's really dependent on the ecosystem and its natural history. So with respect to measuring water quality and studying water quality, which my students are doing here, collecting water and taking measurements, is, ultimately, what kind of information can we glean from the data? And specifically, I would say when you collect water quality over long periods of time, you get a long perspective on what's happening in the lake. So Tyler Harrow-Lyle, who's another doctoral candidate in my lab, he has been studying Lake Scugog for several years, and he's expanded into other lakes in Ontario in his work on starry stonewort. But he got long-term data from the Provincial Water Quality Monitoring Network database, which is an amazing database for tributaries, so for creeks and rivers in Ontario. And the Scugog River is actually the outlet for Lake Scugog. And so he was able to perform some trend analysis on chloride. And looking at this, you see lots of highs and lows, and that's what we call, variability in the data set. But when he subjected this to a trend analysis, he was able to determine that, in fact, now I just put this line in for effect, but it is a statistically significant positive trend, meaning that since the mid-1970s, chloride has been progressively increasing in Lake Scugog, coming out of the outlet from roughly 20 milligrams per liter, getting in upwards of 50 milligrams per liter. Now, most studies based on funding cycles are lucky to get 3 to 5 years of data. And so if we only had 5 years of data of chloride, you can see here that there's so much variability that it would be difficult to determine if any trend was occurring at all. And so hopefully that gives you an appreciation for why it's so important to have long-term data sets. And so why is lake monitoring data more valuable than ever? Well, hopefully I've already convinced you that we can see how conditions change over time. But certainly now there's two key aspects of changes to our environment that really make monitoring data very useful. And I say this because I think there was a time when scientists like myself just viewed monitoring as boring ho-hum. You're collecting data over time, and what are your research questions? What are your hypotheses? And now we're starting to realize, especially those data scientists like Dr. Sharma from last week, is that these long-term databases are very, valuable, like beyond measure, because they provide perspective on how our world is changing. And so climate change is absolutely kind of the most fundamental challenge that we're dealing with, as temperatures, on average, we have global temperatures that are warming. I think I'll switch to my laser pointer here. And as well as precipitation. And we know in Canada that this is related to snowfall, snow melt, but also increased intensity and frequency of summer storms. And for those of us that, enjoy being on the lake in the summertime, certainly we'll be seeing the effects of how these intense storms are going to play a role in affecting water quality. So climate change, when we think about temperature, changes in temperature and precipitation over time, and so this is over decades, and nutrients can be important drivers of algal blooms. And so this is a little bit of a dated graph now, but Dr. Jennifer Winter at Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks, they've changed their name, so I have to always remember if I'm saying the right one, published a paper back in 2011 that really wanted to look at patterns of the reporting of algal blooms in Ontario. So inland lakes were starting to experience increased occurrences of algal blooms, and the time of year. And so if you look from the mid 90s into the 2010, nearing 2010, the last reported algal bloom was being reported later and later in the year. And at this point, it was December. And I know several years ago, I was sent a sample from Sudbury, the Sudbury region. The name of the lake is escaping me right now. I apologize. But it was an ice fisherman had bored a hole into the ice, and it was pea soup green. And so a sample was sent to me. Sure enough, it was microcystis. It wasn't happy, but it was still viable. And I imagine what had happened is there was a late fall bloom, and then there was lake freeze over, and the bloom was kind of trapped right under the ice. But it really just drove home to me that this is a whole new normal. Like when I was, a few decades ago, as an undergrad and grad student, I always learned that, cyanobacterial blooms happen in late summer, early fall. And now I've seen that we're experiencing blooms much later. And this is related, of course, to climate change, because we're having longer warming periods. The summers are extended now well into the fall. And so as it's related to nutrients, again, from the same paper, and again, showing the value of long-term data, look where this data came from, the Lake Partner Program, which Terry had just talked about. It's really ahead of its time as a community science, volunteer-based program that's in partnership with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And just by comparing lakes, so all the lakes, the median phosphorus concentration compared to just those lakes with cyanobacterial blooms, and you can start to see that certainly increases in phosphorus are playing a role. So both nutrients and climate matter. And we wouldn't have known this without this long-term data to be able to analyze. Now, another factor is changing land use. And this really just relates to conversion of natural lands, but of course you can have conversion of agricultural lands to urban lands over time. And so up in the Sudbury region, you're probably more familiar with mining and resource extraction as well. But if you look at this GIF that I've posted, I actually made this a few years ago. It's a really neat site. I think here's the, I don't know if you can jot that down, the URL. But it's related, it's based on Google Earth Engine, which is a really cool site that takes Landsat images over time, a time series, and you can literally see the change in the landscape here from the 80s into through to the 2000s. And I think I have it up to 2019 or 2018. Now the red color is really just it's a false colors of reflecting back. So when you think of green, it is the opposite reflection would be red. And so the red coloring represents plant chlorophyll, sorry. And so what you can obviously see is as the city of Oshawa, and there's the town of Brooklyn up here, and then by 2015, you'll see the 407 pop up. It's very obvious that land use has a major impact on the landscape. And of course, when you increase hardened surfaces, that's going to change the hydrology and the flow of contaminants off of the landscape. So my lab, we're very interested in the effect of urbanization on water quality. Sorry, my mouse is not behaving here. Okay, so now we're ready for the second poll question. I'm not sure, Michelle, if you wanted to read it or do you want me to read it?
I'm happy to do the reading. So which type of land use is a major source of nutrients to receiving waters, in other words, lakes and rivers? Yes, and once again, we're not going to fool these folks tonight.
I wasn't wanting to fool. Oh, yes. We have a very smart group with us tonight.
So rather than agricultural land use or urban land use, the popular selection is both agricultural and urban land.
Which is correct. And you'll see later in my talk where, I think, again, talking about just perceptions and stereotypes about water quality and so forth, that we always think of, agriculture being the major source of pollution because of fertilizers, manure, etc. But urban environments also can be major sources of nutrients as well. There's a study that came out of the US a few years ago, I think it was Hobby et al., that showed that pet waste was a significant source of nutrient pollution. And so urban areas, certainly, even though you think of like concrete and buildings, but people like their gardens and pets and so forth. And so cumulatively, urban areas can be important sources of nutrients as well. Okay, so I wanted to start talking about long-term lake monitoring programs because we do have them in Ontario, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I really wanted to focus on those kind of well-known programs that have been around for a long time because they're really valuable, and I think it's important to highlight them because hopefully up to this point I've convinced you that having long-term data is very valuable, especially for planning for climate change and future land use changes. And so the experimental lakes area, which is in the northwest part of Ontario, certainly has some reference lakes there that have been monitored for well over 40 years. I think even 50 years now, if I remember correctly. So very valuable set of lakes. But of course, they're set in a very kind of a remote area. They're considered pristine. But they have an important role, especially when we're thinking of, or we're interested in the impacts of climate change. And the Lake Simcoe, because I'm thinking about inland lakes, of course, the Great Lakes have their own monitoring programs, but for inland lakes, Lake Simcoe has its own Healthy Lake Simcoe Act, which helps ensure that it's properly monitored regularly. And the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority is involved with that, as well as other provincial and federal stakeholders. And wouldn't it be wonderful if all the lakes in Ontario had their own act, like the Lake Simcoe Act? And in fact, right now there is a public comment period for the Lake Simcoe as they start to renew and kind of kind of review and evaluate the Lake Simcoe Act. Finally, the Northern Lakes Broad Scale Monitoring Program, which is sponsored by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, as well as involvement with the Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks. And you can see it's highlighted in red. So lots of red dots there. I've just kind of lumped in the Sudbury and Dorset Lakes, which are also long-term monitoring, which is really wonderful, especially in Sudbury with respect to recovery from the period of time when acid rain was a big problem. And so when you look at the province here, you can see, wow, there's lots of kind of long-term. Certainly the frequency of monitoring, it goes in say 5-year cycles and so forth, but there's a lot of good coverage there. And then finally, the blue color here is the Lake Partner Program. Okay, so this is a volunteer-based program where samples are collected by volunteers in various lakes. So all those blue dots there. So cottage country is well represented. They send their samples into Dorset, I believe, Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks, MECP. And now FOCA in the last few years has been part of managing this program. And in fact, has hired a new coordinator. I think Liz Favo is here today, I think. And I think that's wonderful because as you'll see with community co-production, it's really important for these types of community science programs to have built in, I wouldn't call it redundancy, but certainly supports in place to make sure that they run smoothly and that the data being collected remains, has integrity built into the program. But of course, the Lake Partner Program is important, but it doesn't do everything. For those of you who participate in the Lake Partner Program, you know that you will, take your Secchi disc measurement and to measure water clarity, you'll collect water samples and the water gets tested back at the MECP lab where they're measuring phosphorus and I know calcium, I think they're still measuring calcium chloride now, which is wonderful to see how chloride is changing as we've seen in Lake Scugog. But of course, there's not everything like chlorophyll A isn't measured or nitrogen is not measured, for example. And also, that's focusing on water quality, but what about the biological condition? And there's a lot of emphasis that gets placed on fish monitoring. But what about the lower aquatic food web and what about invasive species? And there's definitely major gaps. I know the Ontario, I think it's the Benthos Biomonitoring Network. I believe that's what the acronym is, OBBN. There was some work done in Muskoka Lakes, but I think it's still largely relegated to tributaries and not so much lake environment. So there's room for improvement and addressing these gaps. And then finally, many of these monitoring programs focus on the middle or deepest part of the lake, and yet the Nearshore or the Littoral Zone is where most of the action is happening. And it's not to say measuring the deepest part of the lake or the center of the lake is wrong. It helps to if you're being consistent over time. But if you really want to understand, especially for shallower lakes, here you can see, I'm going to give you your Limnology 101 lesson here, where, you have the shoreline over here. And as you go into the lake, as it gets deeper, sunlight penetrates to the bottom to a point where it can no longer reach the bottom because it's too deep. And so really the boundary where sunlight penetrates to the bottom is the littoral zone. And we're referring to it as the nearshore zone because littoral is just one of these limnology terms that people aren't that familiar with unless they're a limnologist. So it's really the nearshore zone. And as you can see, there's plants there, with sunlight being able to penetrate, you're going to have algae and periphyton. And of course, when you have plants, you have habitat for fish. And so it's very, very productive. And in fact, in many lakes, it can be up to 90% of all the biological activity is actually in the nearshore zone. And so I don't know why my mouse is really playing up with me tonight. So there's high biological activity, fish spawning in nursery grounds, and it's the entry point for the runoff off of the landscape. And so this is a busy infographic here showing all the different types of water pollution. It comes from atmospheric deposition, but largely comes off of the landscape, whether it's point sources or non-point sources. What I love about this graphic is that when you look at all those arrows and you see runoff from the land, you have inputs from a river, they're all entering the lake at the nearshore zone. And so it's the nearshore zone is really that front line of receiving a lot of this runoff from the landscape. And so it's important for us to be able to study the nearshore zone to understand how land use and what's happening in the watershed is impacting the lake in, really in a very a sensitive part of the lake as well. Because if this is the place where most of the fish are spawning and rearing their young, and at least the young are using it as nursery grounds. Okay, so hopefully now I've convinced you about long-term monitoring, the nearshore zone, and let's get into what's this community science co-production. Now, community science, you've all heard of it before. It's formerly known as citizen science, and I think there's some people that still use the term citizen science, but there's many of us, including those of us in my research group, that are moving away from citizen science because it's not very inclusive. You don't have to be a citizen to participate. And of course, community science involves both settlers and First Nations communities, Indigenous communities. And so really community science is the intentional involvement of the public in a scientific study or program that produces reliable data for sharing and use by decision makers. And so inherently it's open science. And so for those of you familiar with this concept of open science, I think community science fits into it very well. So that's community science. Well, what's this term co-production? And I must tell you, it's not a new concept. Those in social sciences and health policy research and so forth, they refer to it as participatory research. And it's really just moving from, this kind of linear model where researchers or scientists go out into a community, in this instance into lakes, collect information from locals, collect the water, leave, and then you never see them or hear from them again. And of course, Indigenous communities have had very bad experiences with scientists doing just that, flying in and flying out. And so now there's just this acknowledgement that if we really want to, in this era of reconciliation, as well as address these complex problems with respect to lake management, we need to have all hands on deck. And that's really what co-production is all about. It's not siloing partners where they just play a distinct role and don't interact with the other stakeholders, but that everyone is contributing and are, equally valued. And so this paper, surprisingly, that just came out in 2020 is really adopting this knowledge co-production strategy where it's, the four kind of pillars are it's context-based, it's pluralistic, explicitly recognizing the multiple ways of knowing, and it's goal-oriented so that it's really everyone understands, what the goals are, what the objectives are, and what the deliverables are going to be, and of course interactive. And certainly in our approach to community science co-production is keeping the lines of communication open throughout the entire project. Okay, so that now leads into developing and applying a community science co-production model in the Kawartha Lakes. And as I mentioned at the top, this is primarily based on a collaboration with primarily Kawartha Conservation, which is a conservation authority, Debbie Belika, who is now at Conservation Ontario, and Aaron Smith, who's a doctoral candidate in my lab. And so before I get into the details of the work we've been doing in the Kawartha Lakes, I think it's probably important to introduce the lakes and where they are. They're considered the gateway to cottage country. So if you look at this map, those of you who are from Sudbury know right away where you're located, up in the top left-hand corner. But as you go down and you see Lake Simcoe there, just to the east of Lake Simcoe are the Kawartha Lakes. Now, of course, the Kawartha Lakes are part of a chain of lakes, the entire Trent Severn waterway system that flows through and bisects South Central Ontario. But we really just kind of focus on the main Kawartha Lakes, as well as Lake Scugog, which is down at the bottom here, which in fact is a headwater. And so when you kind of zoom, let's say zoom out, zoom in actually, you can see the land use, and primarily Lake Scugog situated in agricultural dominated land use in its watershed. It's a headwater, so it's actually draining into Sturgeon Lake. And then you can see that, these lakes are situated right in this area known as the land between, where you have this geological transition from limestone to granite dominated bedrock, and you can see much more natural land cover. So it's a really interesting from a scientific perspective, there's so many interesting things to investigate in the Kawartha Lakes region because of this kind of interplay between land use and population growth, but also the interesting geology and natural features. So Debbie Belika, when she was at Kawartha Conservation, was really the one who kind of spearheaded this whole notion of targeting the nearshore zone, recognizing that this is where shoreline property owners have the most impact, as you can see, a heavily developed shoreline. And so fortunately, there's been several organizations, the Great Lakes Nearshore Framework that was developed by Conservation Ontario, and nearshore monitoring protocols. Actually, these are two separate documents that were really informed the approach to nearshore monitoring. And so when we were first setting out, we knew that the objectives, and largely I would have to say this is really directed at Kawartha Conservation as a stewardship organization, very interested in lake management and integrated watershed planning as well, wanted to, for the first time, collect data for the nearshore. So this is what we refer to as baseline information. And then when there's enough data collected over, they go through three-year cycles for collecting this data. They can compare it to open water data. So now you have this really kind of holistic view of your lake. You know what the water conditions are out in the open water, and you know what's happening in the nearshore. And so it gives you much better a sense of lake condition and lake health. And of course, because this is a community science-driven initiative, the findings should be shared with, primarily with those collaborators and partners that are involved, but also for any stakeholder that's interested in the data that's being collected. And then finally, this is really primarily when you have these findings and you're able to synthesize what they mean, then you can use that information to inform educational programs as well as to encourage stewardship. So of course, community science as an approach, I think some people early on were a little bit nervous to adopt, just depending on volunteers with no scientific training per se to collect water, and there's concerns about the quality and so forth. And so there's been quite a bit of scholarship on community science, citizen science over the last 20 years. And what's really been determined over this time period is that there's actually quite a few pros to incorporating community science into any type of research, broad scale research program. And first of all, being cost effective. You can just imagine when you can tap into volunteer labor, you're saving money there. From our perspective, with the type of approach we took, we're involving students, so they're getting training, but they're also cheaper labor because they're getting student rates while they're getting those important skills. And so all told, you do save quite a bit of money. I have to emphasize, though, it's not free and it's not without cost, But when money's tight and you want this information, then community science is definitely a potential way to go. Building social capital in the community, environmental education, increased scientific literacy, because these volunteers get trained, they become invested and engaged in learning why are they collecting the water, what is the water quality going to tell them, how do they interpret the information. And then, of course, being able to get, you'll see in our pandemic study, we're able to get up to 60 volunteers. You can get quite a bit of area, coverage in, the lake that you want to monitor just by having people located, around the lake. And then finally, access to private shoreline. So I thought that was really interesting, that what John was talking about earlier about access, and that's a really important issue, and that probably a big obstacle for studying the nearshore zone has been access to shorelines, especially in really shallow areas where it's hard to get a boat through. And then, if you get too close, you're impeding or infringing on people's properties. So when it comes to the cons, I think I could say with confidence that with our approach, we've actually addressed all of these cons to make them much less of an issue. But early on with community science, and I've talked with colleagues, Carrie Finley at University of Regina, because she does a lot of community science work as well with monitoring lakes out in Saskatchewan, that, there's concern about this data credibility. There's just this idea that only a scientist and a trained technician can collect water and for the results to be meaningful. But there's been, again, enough scholarship now showing that this isn't necessarily the case anymore, and that when you build in supports into the program, you can address and ensure there's QA, QC being addressed. And so quality control in training, ensuring that you're not just having a new person coming in to train the volunteers every week, that sort of thing. And then, engaging with volunteers to ensure that they maintain their interests, especially if you have a 3-year monitoring program, you want to make sure volunteers are in for the long haul. And so there's various strategies to do that. And I'll talk about that. And then finally, lack of expertise in study design and monitoring skills. Well, that's where you have other partners like university partners. You have the Conservation Authority that has practitioners that are experts. They're part of the process that help to ensure that that expertise is available. And so this is really addressing those cons, knowing the strengths of community science with our approach, which is Kawartha Conservation, Ontario Tech, and community, which includes not just the volunteers that collect the water samples and that allow access to their shorelines, but also stewardship groups. So I'm going to be talking about our experience and our study with Lake Scugog. And so it's the Scugog Lake Stewards that really were instrumental in galvanizing their community and getting volunteers to participate. And so this is really a 3-pronged approach, where sometimes you think about community science and it's really just like the Lake Partner Program. You have the lake volunteers, and they'd send in their samples to MECP. But now we have FOCA is really taking this role that I have assigned to Watershed Authority to ensure that there's that integrity of the program, that you have connection between the volunteers and the lab that's doing the analysis. And so I'm going to talk to you about 2 studies that Erin has. She started actually in the Lake Scugog study when she was an undergrad, and then she took over the project as a master's student because she did such a great job as project manager. And then it expanded to a doctoral project focusing on the entire Great Kawartha Lakes region. And so Lake Scugog project is done now, so I have data to show for that. But there's also a pandemic study that we did in 2020 where Erin did pivot, and I know that word pivot's overused, but I'll use the word she pivoted because she lost her field season for 2020, like many grad students did. And so rather than completely losing a field season, she worked with Kawartha Lake Stewards Association, Scugog Lake Stewards, some help from Kawartha Conservation, although their staff were furloughed, unfortunately. But, we just kind of adapted, and it was a really successful year. So I guess I preempted myself there. Okay, so here's Lake Scugog. This was part of a larger Ontario Trillium funded grant that supported several projects in Lake Scugog to look at lake, habitat conditions. That's really kind of the kind of the little germ of an idea for this project was the walleye moratorium in Lake Scugog. And this is not new. There's other lakes across North America that are experiencing declines in walleye populations. And so there was just a lot of concern because this was a prized sport fishing destination. For those of you who maybe have grown up, I know that Lake Scugog was a really popular cottaging area, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so it really just gave us an opportunity just to study the lake, which really had not been studied before, surprisingly. A lake as large as Lake Scugog, yes, it's a reservoir, but it's still a headwater lake that feeds into the Trent Severn Waterway. And so it's important from both a social, ecological, as well as Indigenous perspective, because the Scugog Island First Nation community, it lives on Scugog Island. And so our project out of this larger Ontario Trillium funded project was focusing on the Nearshore using community science as a means to collect nearshore data. And because most of the shoreline is private, it really was a good model for engaging shoreline property owners to collect the samples that we needed. So the first part of this project was really the community scientists. So bi-weekly, every 2 weeks, they would, without fail, go down to the dock on a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. and collect their water following, the strict guidelines of how they were trained. And then the students from Ontario Tech would pick up the samples in coolers. And Ontario Tech's, well, depending on where you are on the lake, like we're 20 minutes from Port Perry, but not too far. So really within a few hours, collecting all these samples. We also had some help. There is a professor at Ontario Tech that lives in Caesarea on the other side of the lake. So she would pick up samples too and help us out. And so, as I say, it takes a village, right? And so these water samples were analyzed for a variety of parameters, coliform bacteria, phosphorus, nitrogen, chlorophyll, etc. But in the second year of this 3-year study, when Erin became a master's student, she added a whole other biological component, which is bioassessment. And so once a month, she'd go to 8 of the sites where the property owners gave permission for access. And so the students would collect water, they'd take on-site field measurements of pH and conductivity, etc., temperature. But they'd also, collect and bring back to the lab, macrophyte samples, zooplankton and phytoplankton samples, and deployment of a Hesterdendi sampler. So this sampler, it's a little bit distorted the way the picture is here, but it looks like coasters, drink coasters. And it's on, they're kind of stacked up on each other, but you'll notice that there's a difference in the depth between each disc here. And that is really to mimic habitat for colonizing macroinvertebrates. So those bugs, the larval stages of aquatic insects, great yummy fish food. And so over the course of a month, these Hesterdendi samplers would be deployed off of the dock in an area that they wouldn't be disturbed. And then Erin and her assistants would collect them and clean them all and collect all of the macroinvertebrates that collected. And also she measured periphyton that grew on the top. And we also had temperature and light logger. So it was a full-scale master's project and lots of information that was being collected. It was just piggybacking on top of the community science study that was already underway. And so as part of the, the kind of making it more of a holistic study, it's not just about the water quality, not just about biological condition of the Nearshore zone, but what are the residents around the lake? So these are the volunteers that, they were, signed up to be volunteers in this project. And so we wanted to get an idea of what their concerns were with respect to their lake. And not surprisingly, we have a skewed population of concerned citizens or concerned residents. And you can see that they're either very concerned or concerned about these various issues, nutrients, aquatic life, swimming, fish edibility, water level. It's a big deal in Lake Scugog because it's a shallow, large lake. And so in summer, during a drought, it loses a lot of water through evaporation. And but when water levels go down the Trent Severn, they'll take it from Lake Scugog. And so this can be a little bit contentious, but overall, they're concerned about their lake. And so we can kind of draw this conclusion that they're getting involved in volunteering because they actually care about their lake, and they're very concerned about a number of issues. So when it comes to this, I think I alluded to it a few slides back about compliance and just interest, maintaining interest of volunteers. They're volunteering their time free of charge. And so how do you maintain interest? And so we were really lucky that going from 2017 to 2019, that it actually improved. Other studies, you normally would see a decline in participation and people dropping out. But I think between kind of adapting and learning, Debbie Belika being a huge part of this, Aaron being a huge part of engagement, so students were actually visiting many of these properties and engaging with the volunteers, that it actually improved over time. And I have to say that there were some substitutes along the way. But overall, when you averaged, they're collecting 10 times each year, collecting water and another observational data, it actually improved. And so we're, working on writing up a paper on assessing this, and because we want to share this kind of like what worked for us. Well, how did we get this? Because if you are going to commit people to more than a year, then you have to really think hard about what's going to keep them engaged. And so I thought I'd throw in a PCA, because what limnologist doesn't love looking at water quality and a PCA, principal components analysis. I'll try and walk you through it. Aaron is looking at various scales of land use in the catchments of all the sites around Lake Scugog to make a connection between what's happening on the land with what's happening in the nearshore zone. Because of course, when you think of Lake Scugog, which is a predominantly agricultural watershed that surrounds the lake, you think, oh, it's agriculture that's, the source of all its woes with nutrients and turbidity and so forth. And so I'm just putting up one PCA that just focuses on the 1 kilometer buffer, which means just the land, the strip of land 1 kilometer from the shoreline around the lake that drains into the sites where the water was collected. And so I just want to draw your attention to, we have agriculture and natural areas basically co-varying together. So they're kind of pulling, driving sites that we see here that are most predominantly ag or natural. And then you have a smaller subset of sites that are predominantly urban developed. So that's the DEV. And really what I want you to notice is that our water quality variables, for the most part, don't really co-vary with any of these land use. In fact, you'd argue it's basically perpendicular. So we just interpret from this is that, neither one is having a controlling force on any of these water quality variables. But I do want you to notice the chloride, and not surprisingly, is more or less co-varying with development. So increased development in the 1 kilometer buffer, we do see higher concentrations of chloride. So this is road salt. And as you saw earlier, there's definitely an increase in chloride in Lake Scugog, and it's probably being driven by increased urban development in the watershed. Now, remember that poll that I gave about, developed in agriculture, this is just for Lake Scugog, but you can see that the median concentration of phosphorus, so when you divide up all the sites in Lake Scugog based on those that are predominantly developed or ag or natural, and you can see that really developed has higher median phosphorus than ag or natural sites. And so we're investigating this a little bit further, but I found in other studies that we do, particularly in urban areas, in Oshawa, the GTA, Durham region, we're finding that when we look at ag and urban influences, urban always seems to come out as being a significant source of nutrients. So it's important for people to start realizing that urban development it doesn't mean a reduction in nutrients, nutrient inputs. Okay, so now to the bioassessment. I just wanted to present some of the findings of Erin's research. And this is the type of data that we like to show the community volunteers, because it really helps them make this connection to lake health. So the organisms that live in the lake, why they're important. They learned that macroinvertebrates, their diversity is really a reflection of lake health, that generally higher biodiversity is more or less, there's lots of kind of, depends that you could discuss, but overall we know that in a lake, when there's higher biodiversity maintained, that's a good thing. And so I believe when Erin did like a discriminant analysis that really divvied up low plant coverage and high plant coverage at the sites, because this is a weedy lake, but a lot of people like to control the weeds. And so when there's removal of weeds, or just there's not a lot of aquatic plants growing, we do see that, generally speaking, macroinvertebrate diversity is lower. And so it gets our volunteers thinking about, well, should they be pulling out those weeds? Because if they like fishing, and they know that fish like a diversity, and we know that where there's higher diversity, there tends to be more of the those juicy macroinvertebrates like Ephemeroptera and Plecoptera, Trichoptera that the fish love to eat, and less chironomids. And so it's starting. People are starting to make that connection, why it's valuable to maintain biodiversity, and we need those plants. Sure, it's not great to swim in, but boy, is it great for maintaining a healthy, productive ecosystem. And so with fecal coliform bacteria, that's an indicator of fecal pollution. And so you can get fecal pollution from agricultural activities, if there's manure application, but also septic systems that aren't functioning. And Lake Scugog actually has a lot of older properties that, the septic systems are old. And as far as I know, there isn't an active effort being made to monitor and maintain these systems. And so we wanted to see how fecal bacteria varied across sites. And certainly with getting data from Environment Canada, we were able to divvy up sites where comparing fecal coliform concentrations, what we call baseline conditions, or base flow conditions, I should say. So it hasn't rained for at least 3 days or more. Or just after, 24 hours after a significant rain event, over 15 millimeters. And consistently, we were seeing that, and this has been shown in other jurisdictions, that when you have these large storm events where the rain is hitting the landscape, it's just driving fecal waste into the lake. And this could even just be, those people who like to have lawns along the lakefront, which the Canada geese love. Well, the Canada geese are pooping on the lawns, and then that it rains and the poop goes into the lake. So clearly we're making this connection with climate change. This is going to be more problematic. So this is kind of data that community volunteers can understand and relate to. And so part of community science co-production is sharing the information, sharing the data. This is what open science is all about. And so the Scugog lake stewards are just amazing at getting people together, providing space for meetings. As an Ontario Trillium Fund grant, so they were responsible for making sure, like they were more or less the project managers for the entire project. But it really was very very positive experience. We're all partners involved. We'd get together, talk science. We'd also engage in these outreach events. Scugog Lake Stewards would run lake weeks, science socials, public presentations as well. And here's Erin giving a presentation on her work, as well as up here talking to local residents in Port Perry on open house day for Lake Week. And then finally reporting. And so part of Erin's thesis work is learning to communicate science in a way that's understandable to non-scientists. And so technical reports were written for our partners, Kawartha Conservation, Scugog Lake Stewards. But of course, our lab is also interested in peer-reviewed publications. And so Erin's already submitted and is working on other papers from this work, because this is high quality data that can be analyzed and interpreted. And then finally, each volunteer, and this is really important to Debbie, to get their own report. You know, they've committed to 3 years in this study. And every year they got a report, but here's an example of what one report. So 6-page report. I'm not going to show you it all. I'm not going to go through it all, but it's just to give you the detail. Sometimes you see report cards and they're just like A, B, C, and they don't give a lot of information. They're visually pleasing, but they don't give a lot of context. And so these reports for each volunteer are detailed, as you can see. They explain what all of the water quality parameters that were measured, where they come from, why they're significant. Then the general results for the lake. And so, you know, its importance of diversity as well as phosphorus, and the red line depicting the provincial water quality objective. And then each volunteer got their own report. And so this site, which is close to Port Perry, tended to be more, have kind of poor conditions, but that's okay. They're getting this information. E. coli is not a big deal, but phosphorus is. And so perhaps trying to think about what kinds of activities they're doing that maybe could help reduce phosphorus inputs into the lake. And so just in the last few minutes now, I just wanted to mention this pandemic study because it really was timely, and it did adopt or still include this kind of model. But of course, Kawartha Conservation, like other CAs, because of lockdown and the restrictions of the pandemic and staff being furloughed, they couldn't participate. But of course, some of their employees as private citizens still were involved. But I would have to say a lot of the slack that got picked up here was Kawartha Lake Stewards Association, with Scugog Lake Stewards that really came in to help with the logistics and in recruiting volunteers. It had to be a different type of study because of social distancing. We couldn't collect nearly as much information or data that we would like to, but we thought nutrients is really essential to kind of keep collecting. And also from a research perspective, it's really fascinating that human behavior changed so dramatically that wouldn't it be interesting to see, because we've got data from previous years and at least 5 of these lakes, to see if we see a signal in the water quality patterns across the Kawartha Lakes. And so we really felt that it was important. We were able to do it. I just had, used my own research reserves to support it. But again, the costs were much lower because we weren't doing the full kind of suite of, and also the bioassessment because of social distancing. But we were able to at least collect some data that really wasn't being collected anymore. As you know, the Lake Partner Program, the Provincial Water Quality Monitoring Program, was shuttered last year. And so this became Aaron's pandemic study. And so really, in summary, Aaron was able to recruit 60 volunteers, including from Curve Island First Nation, who was really supportive and pivotal in getting, filling in the gaps across the entire region. And so 16 lakes in total. 5 of those lakes we have pre-pandemic data for that was analyzed in our lab. So it'll be the same lab analyses. Sometimes when you're comparing data from different labs, there's concern that are they comparable? And so we at least have that capacity. And then because it's a part of Aaron's PhD, there's this community survey component to find out, if we can make a connection between changed behaviors. It could go either way. There's a lot of Americans, for example, that couldn't get up to cottage country. So is there less activity? Or the other side of the coin is we know that a lot of people from Toronto were renting cottages, or people that had cottages were just moving up to their cottage. And so there was actually more use. And I think we're going to find out more with our survey results. If there's just more pressure on septic systems, people, because of, bubbles and so forth, where there's just more capacity, overflow capacity in cottages and so forth. So it'll be interesting once Aaron starts to analyze the data. And so finally, just these take-home points, it's just 2 main ones, is that I'm hoping that I'm getting you to think about community science as more than just, volunteer kind of second-tier science, but in fact, it's quite valuable in filling in data gaps. But these value-added elements, I think, are just as important as the actual data. Engagement and education, I think, science and respect of science has eroded over the last decade for various reasons. And I think scientists have to get out of their ivory towers and get more engaged and bring their research to the community and listen to the community and work with the community to really get the information that's necessary for lake management. And of course, when more members of the public are involved, they're going to be more engaged in stewardship. And when they understand why it's so important, and then they see that there's no policies in place to protect their lakes, they become advocates. And of course, advocates vote. And so I think it's all important. There's this kind of domino effect, I think, when you think about the larger impact that just having these volunteers being involved in your monitoring program. And then, of course, co-production model. It's important to not just think of it as just the volunteers, but they need to be supported. And there has to be, program sustainability and compliance is really, Kawartha Conservation played a vital role there. Lake associations can play that role as well. And of course, having a university player, students get trained. They're trained. I provide my expertise in data analysis and managing that data. And I just think every player has a role to play to ensure that there's kind of long-term viability. And with that, I'd like to just acknowledge Erin, since most of this, in fact, all of this was really coming out of her PhD project. But of course, Debbie Belika was the brainchild really of, starting this whole movement of monitoring the nearshore and using community science. And it evolved in a very positive collaboration. Summer students and other graduate students in the Kirkwood Lab that helped out, and of course Scugog lake-stewards, Kawartha Conservation, and Ontario Trillium Foundation that supported much of the research. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
That was so fabulous. Thanks so much, Andrea. And we do have lots of questions. Just a reminder to everybody that you can upvote questions. So since we do have such a long list, if there are ones that you feel like you'd really like to hear the answers, please, I'll give you a couple of seconds to click on those thumbs ups. And I may jump around a little bit and not always answer in direct order, but I'll try to respond to the enthusiasm from the crowd. Okay, so this is an interesting one, and coming, I think, from someone in a stewardship group. In the absence of a committed academic partner or big grant dollars, where should lake associations dedicate their time and effort?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And already I'm involved in some, side projects that have no real dollars associated with them. And, I guess just the first thing that comes to mind is people like, you hear this term institutional memory. Well, I think lake associations and stewardship groups need that institutional memory. And if you get people that can stick around, they can get trained, they can become experts. And so over time, if they have the energy, like I think of the Scugog lake stewards, Barbara Cartine, those of you, she won an award from FOCA, I think it was last year. But I think every stewardship group probably has a champion. And so I really can see the value of that. But of course, if you have a high turnover and people that come and go, it makes it more difficult. But I think if you just have a core group of people that become, they bring in, a lot of people, especially when they retire. And I know this is what my retirement goals are, is to get much more involved with my lake association, but that they're engineers, they're teachers, so it's not like they're coming in with absolutely no background knowledge or anything. So I guess that was my roundabout way to say that I think it can be done, but you just need core people to commit time and effort and just have people to support them as well.
Awesome. I assume there's lots of academics out there who, after this talk, will be keen to hear from stewardship groups too, and start linking up and making some connections. Okay, this question came in actually before you mentioned Canada geese. But realizing that urban environments and pets are contributing a lot of nutrients and potential problems, what can we be doing about the same influences from Canada geese?
Well, the number one thing you can do is don't provide any habitat for them. So there's actually a lot, if you connect with Watersheds Canada, Kawartha Conservation, I know as you go further north, but no, Sudbury, is it Sudbury Conservation? Is that what they call themselves, or Conservation Sudbury? But all of these agencies have amazing stewardship documents and educational materials, but they can tell you how to naturalize your shorelines and not have, like, Canada geese, they just love manicured lawns, and because they can see their predators in that. If you naturalize your shoreline, you are going to minimize a Canada geese wanting to hang around.
Perfect. Okay, one gap you mentioned but didn't talk a lot, and I know it's an area of your expertise, is on invasive species. Do you have any key things you'd like to share about your work on invasive species, or things that associations can be doing to contribute to invasive species monitoring?
Sure, I could answer that. So the invasive species right now that we're studying, so I have another grad student in my lab, is starry stonewort. Its scientific name is Nyctalopsis obtusa. It is technically an alga. It is. It looks like an aquatic plant, but from a morphological and evolutionary standpoint, it's actually an algae. Its cells are massive. It doesn't have true branches or roots. But because it behaves like an aquatic plant, it can smother them and outcompete and completely take over an aquatic weed bed. And we've seen that in Lake Scugog, unfortunately. And now we know that with the surveys that Tyler has done, that it's throughout the Kawartha Lakes, particularly in the Trent Severn system. And so there's an example of where there's really no government support or funding for monitoring or management or anything. And so local lake stewardship groups have stepped up. The Environment Council at Stony Lake and Clear Lake, and I think Lovesick. I think there's a few lakes involved with the Environment Council, Kawartha Lake Stewards Association. So they've stepped up to get volunteers to monitor for starry stonewort. And there's a collaborative, starry stonewort collaborative in the States and in New York State that is really amazing with sharing information. Again, this whole open science, open sharing of information and training even. So I am actually going to be involved with where there's really no funding to support it, but just people that are, with a little bit of advice and guidance are going to be monitoring for starry stonewort. So there's just an example again of stewardship groups, lake associations stepping up to fill the gap of the lack of support, especially for, and this is where my bias shows, but when it comes to aquatic invasive species, plants and algae just get ignored. It's all about the fish really, and maybe some zooplankton. And so, in fact, starry stonewort, the story with starry stonewort is that because it's technically an alga, which is singular for algae, it wasn't this, the invasive species program with the OMNRF. It wasn't a plant, so it wasn't their purview. It was MECP. They do the Spills Action Center was where you're supposed to direct your questions. Now that's changing now. Now there's EdMaps, which is this great app that all of you should have for if you're in your lake and you identify an invasive species, please, open EdMaps and put your location in and your identification of what you found. But it's luckily changing. But when I first kind of inquired about, what kind of, what do we know about starry stonewort, no one knew anything. So it's only really in the last few years that we're starting to understand that it's taken over, unfortunately. Sorry, I could go on and on about starry stonewort, but I won't.
No, it's really interesting. Okay, so a bit of a different angle now, but we were talking a lot about shoreline development and multiple types of impacts it can have on water quality and drinking water quality. So should we be restricting shoreline development? Should we be imposing remediation of developed shorelines? What's your thoughts?
This is a really contentious issue. I know right now in Halliburton, there's a bylaw that was, just from, I think right now it's on pause, but because there needs to be more consultation, but there's just kind of this arbitrary number of, 100 meters back or 100 feet back, sorry. And 70% of your property can't be developed. And unfortunately, just because of poor planning, over the last 50 years, there's people have properties that would not fit under the new rules. And so my personal perspective is that there needs to be a multi-pronged approach to dealing with this. I think for new developments, there absolutely should be some kind of like benchmarks for the minimization of development. But for those that have already developed, I think we need to start working with people to encourage them to naturalize their shorelines. And again, just it's a long slog of effort, and it'll probably take a long, I don't even want to say decades, but I hope not, but just to shift people's perspective and what they making the connection that their activities and how they develop their properties on the shoreline impact the water. And I know because I cottage up in Halliburton on high quality water quality lake. And people just don't realize that just because they're doing it, they don't see an impact. But if everyone's hardening their shoreline, not maintaining their septic system, and just really removing, just turning it into hard surface as opposed to, a shoreline that could have a buffer, we're going to end up with a lake that's going to have algal blooms, and especially with climate change. So this is actually just it's like a fairly complex answer. I wish I could just say everyone should do this arbitrary number of 70% or what have you, but I don't think it's that simple. I think it's a little bit more, it should be kind of staggered depending on, grandfathering and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, I love the next line of thinking here, and it's about sort of the balance of value in long-term monitoring, which you did such a great job of playing up, and those of us who lead long-term monitoring programs sure appreciate it. But then also the role of new project data, place-based data. How do you balance the importance, and how do you derive new information where you don't have long-term data?
Honestly, in an ideal world where there is more funding support by all levels of government, we'd have both. But I think for too long, we just have these cycles where a lot of place-based research, research that could be done in a short period of time to answer important questions, absolutely, looking at functions and interactions and so forth. But over time, and again, I think because monitoring was always viewed as kind of boring, and it's just, you actually have to wait a long period of time to actually see the benefit of it. I just think we need both. I think you need to support I think really it's governments primarily, like the Lake Partner Program, I hope continues, because I think it is a way of being a little bit more cost effective and covering more area, more sites. But I think that there needs to be a caretaker of that data that's going to be consistent over time, and that's where government plays a role. Whereas the shorter term research, absolutely, where it commonly is in academic researchers, maybe even consulting companies and NGOs that can do these types of studies. But I think as part of this research ecosystem, both have an important role.
Awesome, great answer. Okay, this one's a totally different stream, but I can remember, 15 years ago when sea-doos and their invasion on the Nearshore was a really big deal. And now there's wake boating, and there's lots of ways that we recreationally use nearshores. Is that a threat to aquatic ecosystems or water quality?
Yeah, I would say it's not in my area of research, but just from what I've read, wakes cause erosion. And so for a lake like Lake Scugog, it's a very muddy lake. And so, uncontrolled wake generation from, wakeboarding and canoeing and so forth, that's only going to contribute to, and they're already dealing with, because of ice thaw and freezing, build up. They're losing their shorelines in Lake Scugog, for example. So I would say for sure that's another contentious issue, because there's people who they feel that they're entitled to these types of recreational activities, enjoying the outdoors. But I think everyone needs to kind of, if we all had a sustainable mentality that, everything in moderation, but there's got to be some ground rules so that we're not destroying the environment in the process.
Makes sense. Okay, so now there's a few questions about sort of the interaction between the information that stewardship groups and other community-led groups are collecting, and those policy levers of the influence on the decision makers. So do you have any insight into the best ways to make those connections and have that information feeding its way into actual on the ground management?
Yeah, wow, that is actually really it's a great question, because it is a question that needs to be addressed, and so I would just say from the perspective of like the local, so conservation authorities play, and right now unfortunately it's a very difficult time because of what's happened with Schedule 6 and the defunding of conservation authorities, because they have this important role in integrated watershed management as well as lake plan development and management. They are definitely a key player in working with communities, using that data, all data that can be collected to inform their lake plans. So that at least is happening. But I do think that there needs to be more engagement for other government bodies that are in some way connected to lake management at both the provincial and federal level, even because we're thinking about fish habitat and so forth. They need to be involved more, but I know the bureaucracy and trying, because believe me, I've interacted with, I have wonderful colleagues at these different government institutions, but they are kind of hamstrung by the rules and procedures in place. So I think there just needs to be a little bit more, less inertia and more movement and change.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so then there is a fair bit of interest in just your knowledge of Lake Scugog in general. One question is, why is swimming prohibited in Lake Scugog? And I don't know if that's a consistent thing, but do you know much about the beach closures of swim
That
culture?
might be related to, and so Tyler, my grad student, he actually published a paper last year in Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences related to microcystis blooms in Lake Scugog. And also Dr. Jennifer Carosi and I, she's a paleolimnologist, so she has core data that, looks at the, because Lake Scugog is a shallow, weedy lake. You typically do not see a polymictic lake. So it's a shallow lake that has huge wind fetch. So it mixes frequently. Microcystis does not like active water and mixing. And so it's not a lake that has historically had algal blooms. And so 2016 was the first year that there was isolated incidents around the lake and embayments where microcystis bloomed. And so when that happened, samples were sent to MECP Spills Center and analyzed, and they were positive for microcystin, which is a toxin. And so now they just have permanently signs up, even when there's no microcystis is not, it's not there all the time. It's very transient. And so, but I think just because of concern for public health, because there are beaches that's probably being alluded to here, I think that's what's happening. So unfortunately, Lake Scugog is a lake in transition. These algal blooms are becoming more frequent, and actually Tyler was able to show in his modeling that there's definitely a climate change, precipitation and temperature are factors, but also starry stonewort has changed the whole structure of the food web in the lake. And we know that others have even shown a connection between favoring some phytoplankton over others, and microcystis seems to coexist quite well with starry stonewort, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I think that is where we should leave it. And I know that Andrea's contact information will be available if you want to talk more about co-production or any of these questions, or how to get engaged with these types of activities. So just thank you so much, Andrea. That was so riveting, truly. And I'll turn it over to Richard to close us off.
All right, so it's unfortunate that we weren't able to get to as many questions as we would like to, but since Andrea's going to leave her information there, hopefully you'll be able to contact her if you have important questions that you think need to be addressed. I just want to thank everyone for their contributions tonight, and in particular Foka and Michelle, who's running the back end of the webinar session, and Dr. John Gunn and Bree Edwards from Valley Living with Lake Center, and in particular our speaker for this evening, Dr. Andrea Kirkwood. It's very encouraging to learn of the positive impact of citizen science in providing data for scientific investigation. And I'm sure there will be a number of organizations who are on tonight who will be thinking about those possibilities for their own particular locations. So when you leave the webinar, you'll be linked to a survey. Hopefully you can provide us with some feedback about this presentation. And just a little bit about our final presentation next week. It's going to be done by Dr. John Small, who's very well known internationally. He's a biology professor at Queen's University, but he also holds the Canada Research Chair in Environmental Change. He's authored over 620 journal publications and chapters since 1980, as well as 21 books, and he will be presenting on the power of the past, tracking lake ecosystem changes in an Anthropocene world. So recent opinion polls suggest that there are still a significant portion of general public who believe that there's scientific controversy regarding global warming. However, as most of us understand now, this is untrue, as very strong scientific consensus exists on the reality of human-related climate change. The ecosystems around us have been recording long-term environmental conditions for millennia in a wide spectrum of natural archives, including the wealth of information that he's been tracking in lake sediments. So his presentation will examine the importance of using data acquired over appropriate timescales from lake sediments, spanning the high Arctic to Ontario, to inform evidence-based policy decisions using examples of climate-related ecosystem changes, such as increased algal blooms, as well as episodic events such as flooding. Stay safe by following the COVID regulations in your area. Hope to see you next week, and good night.